between these three layers. Or we can even say what is law, because let's not assume, lawyers always like to assume that everyone interested in trade is a lawyer as well. So there are people in the room that may want to challenge that assumption that they want to know about after, but they are not necessarily lawyers. So so some of the things I would say may sound too elementary, especially to our learned silks in the room. So some of the points I'll make maybe, especially defining law, defining international law, but you please bear with us so that we carry everybody along, such that by the time we get into the international trade law itself, it will be easier for everyone to understand. The next module that will be taught by the learned silk will be international trade law. So my job is very simple, is to lay a foundation for that, so that you'll be able to follow Prof's submissions later. So I will start with an introduction on what law is, what international law is, the historical development of international law, basic contemporary issues in international law, and then we'll provide concluding thoughts. Of course, like every lawyer, we start our training in Nigeria, you go to the law school, you become a lawyer. But I then deviated to the path of following international law, as opposed to some other branches of law, that one could have been practicing. And so I've been practicing international law for quite a while. The practice of international law simply means it could be either advising clients in multiple jurisdictions on transactions. In fact, I started my career first at the UN in Geneva, and then, moved on to become a counsel working in the global law firm Northern Rose Fulbright in Canada then. So I was called to the bar there and practiced for a while, again advising clients in multiple jurisdictions, and then making a switch to academia, teaching international law. So by the end of my module, you would understand the basic opportunities as well, the career opportunities in international law and how that connects with trade. I asked a simple question then. I said, what is law? Does anybody want to try? I know the theorists, the philosophers will tell you that they need 2 days to define law itself. Because law itself is a very debated concept. People view it from different perspectives. Those that are moralists, they view it as something else. Those that are positivists, they view it as something else. But I won't go into that debate. One can just think of law as a set of rules and norms that shape society. And I always remember, the famous philosopher who said, without, law, that's Thomas Hobbes, we will return back to the state of nature in which human life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That is a nature, that is a state of chaos in which everybody can do whatever they want. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You annoy me, I do whatever I want. That is what Thomas Hobbes described as the state of nature, a very chaotic state. So law itself is an attempt to establish regulations and norms that will shape human behavior, the way we should talk, the way we should behave, the way we should interact, the way we should drive, right? Without which everybody will just do whatever they want. And every state has its own law. Every country has its own law. So, if you are in Italy, when you are in Rome, you behave like the Romans because they have their own laws. When you are In China, they have their own laws. We even know that in some parts of the world, they have civil law, right? And in some parts of the world, they have what we call common law. So you then ask that since every country already has its own laws, why do we then need another branch of law called international law? Again, does anybody want to try to answer that question? Of course, basically, international law is the law of nations. We have talked about every country having its own law, but it became obvious over time that there was a need for a sort of harmonization of rules and norms that will be cross-cutting, that will form the basis of civilization in many parts of the world. So I like to think of international law as the law of nations, the law governing the interactions between one country and the other. My slide is not moving, Abraham, maybe. So, international law itself developed based on the promise, especially it developed rapidly in the aftermath of the World War, in which it was clear to the global community that we cannot resolve our disputes like this. There's a problem, everybody carries gun and then, start doing whatever we want. This cannot be civilization. So that was, I think the World War II played a very huge role in the coagulation of rules that will guide states. So you can think of international law as the law of nations, governing the relationships between states. It also governs the relationship between states and international organizations, right? And it's based on the principle that the world will be a better place if we cooperate. Of course, some of the things that I'm saying now, in the aftermath of the World War for peace, if you place it side by side, what is happening in the world right now, then you say, are you sure that international law still exists? And I have my own comment, I have my thoughts on that, especially the activities of Donald Trump, but I will not go into that. So the premise of international law is to promote cooperation. It is based on the understanding that no one country can achieve progress on its own. A country cannot exist in isolation, right? You have goods and services, you have oil and gas, for example, and you want to sell it. You cannot sell your oil to yourself. You're going to sell it to another country. So you need that framework for promoting cooperation in trade, for promoting cooperation in environmental issues, for promoting cooperation in dispute resolution. That exactly is the essence of international law. You can also hear some people then say, I'm an international law practitioner, or some will say I'm a diplomat. And I like to distinguish to say international diplomacy itself is the process of international lawmaking, the process of communicating. And I always use the example that in our own videos that we watch, back in the days, if the king has a message to pass to the king in another village, the king will send someone and say, take this to the other person. The way the person delivers that message, at times, is more important than the message itself. Because if the person takes that thing and goes to the other village and throws it at the king and says, my king said I should give you this, it can start war. So diplomats are those that take the message of one country to another. So being appointed as a diplomat, as an ambassador, and you'll meet many of them tomorrow. There are a lot of diplomats coming for the conference. These are people that have been trained in international law, in foreign relations, in the act and skill of taking Nigeria's message to the rest of the world. When ambassadors are appointed, a lot of time is spent training them, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the skills they must exhibit. Because the message they are taking is important, but the way they present it when they leave is perhaps more important. So diplomacy is the craft of communication, the process of, taking your country's message to the rest of the world. And we often do that during international law treaty-making process. When you are in the UN building or you are in the African Union building and everyone is presenting their country's position, you present yours, And that's how international law is made. So I mentioned that as far back as pre-1945, and one can divide the history of international law to maybe three important phases: pre-1945, 1945, and then post-1945. And you wonder what is so special about 1945. Now, pre-1945, before the UN, we had scholars such as the Dutch scholar Hugo Grotius and the rest of them already arguing in their works, in their books, that we need laws that bind all nations, regardless of their own local custom or laws. We need that, cross-cutting set of rules that defines how states should relate to the other. Some of the things they were looking for are things like reciprocity. No one state is bigger than the other. If you do this to me, I do it to you too. If you say that my own plane should not land in your country, then your own plane should not land. That's the norm of reciprocity, right? So they were already thinking there is a need for those sort of basic rules that will clarify how states should relate. And another important event was the establishment of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which again created what we would describe as the first attempt to establish a set of rules that are cross-cutting to states. And you then have the establishment of the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations. The League of Nations was established in 1920. You then also had the Permanent Court of International Justice. And this was an attempt to respond to the impact of the First World War, to say, well, how can we negotiate next time so that when there is a dispute, we all come together, we state our position. And you then have the adoption of the Montevideo Convention in 1933, which remains very important till today. What makes you a state? What makes you a country? And this is an important question till today. And you have the Montevideo clarifying that on what is a state, when do you become a state. And for example, in Canada, you may have been following the news over years that the province of Quebec, which is French-speaking, they have agitated for many years that they are a country, they are a state, and should be so recognized. But there was a debate that they did not meet the criteria of a country, a state, under the Montevideo. Of course, if you read the constitution, you see that for you to be recognized as a state, you must have geographical, many criteria, which you will see that Canada's response back then was that they had a referendum, for people to vote, just yes or no. Should Quebec be allowed to live as a country of its own? But luckily for Canada, the referendum failed. So Quebec did not achieve that threshold, and so till today, Quebec is part of Canada. But it still remains a fragile, relationship because it's just French-speaking. And we've had that in many parts of the world as well, Catalonia in Spain and the rest. Now, for a territory to be recognized in international law as a state, it must meet the criteria in the Montevideo. So the Montevideo Convention remains very, very important. Of course, you will see that those early efforts focus more on war, peace. I think 1944 was the first time that international law then began to look into trade and economic instruments, to say the role of international law is not just to prevent war. How can we also use international law to foster cooperation, right? And this was the adoption of the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, which it was this agreement that led to the creation of the World Trade Organization. Do you know anything about the World Trade Organization right now? Anyone? There's something special about the WTO right now. What? Of course, Nigeria's Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the Director General. So we are very proud of that. So the World Trade Organization is there to promote trade, to remove all barriers to trade, to ensure that your goods can flow from your country to the other without any hindrance. That was the reason why the WTO was established. And so the WTO has been there promoting that. We also have the International Monetary Fund, trying to establish a coherent framework for the transfer of financial resources from one country to the other, ensuring benchmark standardization for financial regulation across the world. I know Nigerians, for us, we always talk about the IMF in terms of whether we are owing them or we are not owing them, but the IMF plays a much more advanced role beyond just giving loans for development and construction. Then, of course, you have the World Bank Group, which, again, provides financial services and support to states, especially for development efforts, development financing. So the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement is indeed a milestone development in international law. Then we had 1945. So we've talked about pre-1945. Then 1945, very crucial, because this was when the United Nations Charter was adopted. There was a discussion that, well, the League of Nations was not really representative of the whole world, and it did not really have a structure that will enhance its presence across the world. So countries came together in 1945 and decided to create a body that is much more all-encompassing, called the United Nations. And so the UN Charter is very, very important to the understanding of international law, because it establishes the UN, which is the largest organization, intergovernmental organization, that has presence across the world and delivers development support. If you look at Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations, it says, the purposes of the United Nations are to maintain international peace and security. Of course, the idea of peacekeeping is still very crucial. To develop friendly relations amongst nations based on the principle of equal rights and self-determinations of peoples. To achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character. So you see that that economic aspect is indeed very key to the work of the United Nations. And it says it will do that, to ensure fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, and to harmonize actions of nations in attainment of these common ends. There's hardly, I don't think, you can only think of maybe just very few countries that are not part of the UN. Almost all countries of the world are part of the United Nations. So the UN is indeed very crucial to international law. But the UN is not the only international organization. We also have the African Union at the regional level. We have ECOWAS at the sub-regional level in West Africa. And we have similar regional bodies, and sub-regional bodies across maybe East Africa, even the Maghreb Union in North Africa. You have even in Southern Africa. So and the whole idea of these bodies will be to bring states together to chart a common course, whether it's in trade, whether it's in peacekeeping, to formulate common positions that will shape, that will make relations easier amongst them. The UN has 6 organs, which every international lawyer will know. The General Assembly is very crucial. Every year you hear that heads of states are meeting in New York at the UN. It is for the General Assembly, because the General Assembly is the highest decision-making body in the UN, which is where heads of states from all countries gather, mostly for a month, every September, October, in New York. New York is the seat of the UN. Then you have the Security Council, which is, the security arm of the UN. It is meant to promote international peace. It is meant to declare efforts to end wars or to support peacekeeping in different parts of the world. Of course, a lot of scholars have written articles on whether the Security Council is fit for purpose, especially because of the permanent members that have veto rights. But again, I will not bore you with those debates and arguments. But especially now with what is going on across the world, and people have been saying, what is the Security Council doing? You know, why are they not stopping the war? But you would have seen that the Security Council recently tried to take some steps which was blocked and vetoed. Which, you know, we always have that problem. And you've had people ask, why is Africa not, why does Africa not have a permanent seat in the Security Council? My answer is very simple. The permanent members of the Security Council are the founding members of the UN. So one can see that it's like when you start something and you start something and you create a permanent rule for yourself, you know, it's difficult to then even adopt a resolution that will change that, because those 6, you have to go through them for them to agree to remove that permanent veto power that they've given to themselves, or permanent seat that they've given to themselves. We will continue to write on these issues, but the bottom line is that there is a UN Security Council and it has some permanent members, and Africa is not represented. Then you have the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, which focuses on economic relations, economic issues. Then you have the Trusteeship Council, and you have the UN Secretariat. So if you have a friend that says, I work for the UN, they are basically a member of the UN Secretariat. The UN Secretariat is headed by the UN Secretary General, you know, and the UN, so the UN Secretary General sits in the UN headquarters in New York, trying to promote, you know, the aim of the work of the Secretariat is to support countries in all of these instruments or treaties that they adopt. And then you have the 6th, which is the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. Disputes are inevitable aspects of human life. There will always be a situation whereby one country believes the other has not done well. Instead of resorting to war, then the ICJ was established to be that body that resolves disputes between states. So, of course, the International Court of Justice has its seat in The Hague. You will, of course, know that over the years, we've had Nigerians that became judges of the ICJ, which is, you know, a very, very proud. I don't think there are many other African countries that can say we've had 3. You have Professor Teslim Elias, who even became the president of the court. You've had Prince Bola Ajibola. You've had Onyema, yes, Godfrey Onyema, who also, and right now we have Olufemi Elias, who is a judge ad hoc on the court, and currently Nigeria's candidate. Nigeria, of course, nominated him to. So he's a member of the ILA. In fact, our patron. So we have been in prayers that his nomination and bid will be successful. Yes. So the ICJ is indeed very crucial. And I always want to mention the statute of the ICJ, because this is the instrument that created the ICJ. And you will see why the statute of the ICJ is crucial. Article 1 of the statute of the ICJ says, the International Court of Justice, established by the Charter as the principal judicial organ of the UN, shall be constituted and shall function in accordance with the provisions of the present statute. Article 2, the court shall be composed of a body of independent judges elected regardless of their nationality from amongst persons of high moral character who possess the qualifications required in their respective countries for appointment to the highest judicial office, or are jurisconsult of recognized competence in international law. And if you go on to study the chart, and I understand that this material have been made available, the statute of the ICJ is already in your course platform, so you can download it and read it. The reason why the statute of the ICJ is important to us as international lawyers is that that is the document that stipulates the sources of international law. As we go on, you see that it is in that document where it says, any dispute that comes before this court, these are the sources of law that we will adopt. And that has become automatically the source of international law. Right? The statute of the ICJ is also crucial because it lets us know the sort of disputes that the court can resolve. An individual cannot sue their country at the ICJ. The ICJ is not meant to be the appellate body of the Supreme Court. No. It's always the dispute between states. And they have, formal adjudication whereby they can resolve dispute between one state or the other. They can also give what we call advisory opinion, whereby maybe the UN writes to them to say, what do you think about what is going on right now in the Middle East, for example? Can you give us an advisory opinion? Of course, as the name suggests, it's advisory, it's not binding. They will just give their opinion on that. So the ICJ is indeed very crucial, and many international lawyers spend their time on the ICJ website, just checking what have they said recently or what have they done recently, because they provide the jurisprudence that we analyze. 1969 is also important, the adoption of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and that document has also been provided in your course material. Because the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, just as the start of the ICJ, this document is very crucial. It tells us how international treaties are adopted. How can an instrument become a treaty? In fact, it starts by defining what a treaty is, Article 2. A treaty is an international agreement concluded between states in written form and governed by international law, whether embodied in a single instrument or in two or more related instruments. It is the Vienna Convention. For any instrument to then become a treaty, it must have passed through the criteria that the Vienna Convention has elaborated. So, and if you look at the Vienna Convention, it tells us that there are different stages. How do we even have a convention? Well, in fact, number one, what is a treaty as we've defined? It is any instrument that has been adopted by two or more states. You may hear international lawyers say, oh, but it's a bilateral treaty. A bilateral treaty simply means if it's just between two states. Or if you hear them say it's a multilateral treaty, it means it's a treaty between more than two states. So the AFTA is a multilateral treaty because it is, cross-cutting across more than two countries in Africa. How was AFTA adopted? Just as any treaty, negotiation first. So someone comes up with the idea that I think we need a new instrument that is Africa-oriented, that is Pan-African. Forget about the Bretton Woods Agreement, forget about all these international instruments, forget about the WTO instruments. We need an African trade instrument. And then African countries came together, mostly within the umbrella of the African Union meetings, to say, okay, let's propose a treaty, let's negotiate. Then the negotiation process, of course, led to its official adoption. The negotiation process can take months. People, countries will say, oh, can you change Article 1, Article 2? And this is where diplomats come in, because they are the ones representing the country, reading the text and say, oh, we propose that you remove this, we propose that you add this. Then after all of that, an instrument is adopted. But adoption itself does not make it law yet. There has to be what we call ratification. Ratification is the process whereby you have adopted the instrument. A state will then write an official letter indicating its willingness to be bound by that treaty. That is what we call ratification. And most treaties will say, until when you have at least 70 ratifications or 50, depending, then it will not become law yet. So even though it has been adopted, has it been ratified? If it has not gathered the number of ratifications, then it is not law yet. Of course, the process of ratification, during ratification, you see some states very clever, and we always see this with the United States. They ratify and they say, well, we ratify this treaty with reservations. With reservations means we don't want to be bound by the following provisions. We ratify, but remove these provisions from us. And at times, you find the US using that tool very effectively. A treaty with 20 articles, they say we ratify, but we have reservations to 19. The implication is that officially they are a member, so they can attend meetings and then say, oh yeah, of course the US has ratified, the US is a member, but they have made reservations to almost all the provisions. So, Now, Then, and you know, they use this ratification instrument, especially I notice in my research that it is mostly when it is an economic, you know, any instrument that may impact economic development. The US will either not ratify at all, or they will ratify with reservations. And you would have seen that the US, for example, pulled out of the Paris Agreement on climate change.